I've seen several wonderful things occurring around the world, and one of them is how Italy's musicians are coming out of their homes and they're just playing out into the street. Things like that give me so much, they encourage my heart. There's a concept that I'd like to share, and that is that in artwork, having limitations is part of what makes it possible to go ahead and create, because in all materials that we work with in art, each set of materials has certain parameters about the way it works. There are soft materials like chalk and paints, very fluid materials, clay, you know, and they all have certain properties. So limitations are not necessarily a bad thing. I know that in America we have a national mythology of thinking about no restrictions, no limits, and although I think that's possible, I tend to think that there is an inherent value, there's kind of a value in having a certain set of practices that one accepts and respects. It's the notion basically of having a kind of practice or a kind of discipline where there's a certain way that we can come to work within a prescribed activity and go deeper into it and go deeper into it and go deeper into it, because we accept certain limits, we accept certain confines. In meditation, we may accept the discipline or the limits, if you will, of sitting still, resting our bodies in order to deepen the activity that's going on in our brain and in our breathing. There are a lot of different ways to meditate. I mean, there's walking meditation. I do meditation through art, and also quiet seated meditation. Well, there are a lot of different ways to do this, but the idea is that we accept the limits of a certain period of time, and we separate ourselves from the typical activities that we would do in order to focus our mind and our heart in a kind of a deep way. And so I think accepting limits helps us enter a world that's way beyond limitation, and it's an energetic world that's way beyond limitation. But I think it's okay to accept limits. I think having limits and having a framework to operate in, a structure, if you will. Accepting structure is not a bad thing. Accepting structure is a wonderful thing. It's a benefit. It's not a restriction. It's not, it's not something that we have to balk at. Accepting some routine, some limits is really, it's very productive. It's very productive. In art, we accept the limitations of the media that we work in, and it's part of what allows us to explore the nature of what a particular medium offers, what clay will do when we touch it, and how much moisture the clay has in it, or how much dryness, and what different forms you can build, and what different surface textures you can apply in the stages as the clay goes from very wet to very dry. All of those are parameters of an art material, for example, that allow us to have all this exploration, this wonderful exploration. And it's the same with everything in the media continuum, from really soft materials to pen and ink, really hard, constrained, precise materials. It's something that as art therapists or as artists, we learn to really relish that full range of different materials that offer different properties. And they all have different different constraints, they have different limitations and different possibilities at the same time. Those two things to me go together. They're not really opposites. They're a dialectic. So I guess I want to offer that as a way of thinking about our time right now, of being inside of our home, sheltering in place, rather than having all of the social contact that we would typically have. It furthers an exploration, and that's a gift right now. There are several things that we need to explore, and one of them is the level of burden that we've been imposing upon the planet by our demand for more and more and more stimulation, and ever greater endeavors to exact our will upon the planet. And this kind of has stilled humankind a little bit, and gathered us up a little bit, so that we can reflect upon these things. We're not putting the fuels into the air from flying as much. We're not, when humans are not all about our busyness, we give a little relief and a little space to other life forms that we otherwise dominate very heavily as a species, I think. So all of that is really, it's worth being thankful for. I think that's worth being thankful for.